this event is all about how do we empower startups, etc. To set the foundation, Sam, you will share your screen and show your presentation, your introduction.
Great, happy to. As far as introductions go, I think maybe I'll just start with a quick introduction to who I am, and then I'll go ahead and share my screen, the presentation itself. My name is Sam Bobertz. I have been, over the last 10 years, working with companies around problem solving and looking at it basically going as far upstream as possible. You can go, if you go far enough upstream for any problem, you at some point or another will see your own reflection. And the idea being that, our relationships with problems are very intimate and they are very personal. And the ways in which we deal with problems, generally speaking, have to do with how we orientate ourselves. To get the sort of optimal outcomes, it's best to see the bigger picture. And so I work with companies around exploring both in terms of mindset and how we are looking at ourselves in relationship to the world in general, but also in terms of how we then actualize that through behavior. We use different sort of multimodal sort of approaches through either whether it's theater-based approaches, cognitive behavioral therapy approaches. I use a lot of tools from sort of applied well-being and mindfulness domains because there's a lot there that's actually developing around the world that's extremely rich and helps us gain a higher understanding and capacity to kind of see ourselves and to gain greater agency in how we orientate ourselves. And this is something that I do with businesses in different industries across Asia. I'm going to go ahead, and I think part of my presentation actually kind of connects to this. Language is a technology. It's not often the way we think about it. It's something that's quite intimate to us, but language is a tool. You're not born speaking German or Bahasa or Tagalog or Cantonese. It's something you learn how to do. There's sort of a structural, functional, formal system that is in place of symbols that you learn how to wield. And how effectively you wield that, now that is the art of communication. And the way in which we are able to see the difference between these two things is, I think, really important. And I would like to start today's conversation in terms of my sharing to kind of outline what is maybe subtle but significant about recognizing that language, even something as intimate that we use every day, like language, is in fact a technology, actually has it speaks to greater understanding of ourselves and our relationships with not only the technologies that we use, but also with ourselves as professionals and amidst organizations, especially as business owners. And so, the ability to communicate effectively and the ability to see the ways in which we're able to get and transfer data in terms of what's in my heart and in my mind over to an audience, as I said, is an art form, and it uses the technology of language. So an example I often use is, say, for instance, if I say the word feather, I could say the word feather to everybody here, and everybody on this call could go, yeah, like a bird's feather. We understand what you're talking about. However, I take that feather and I ask you all to draw a picture of it and then add color to it. And then we all sort of shared that image to one another. What you'd recognize is actually everybody's feather is a little bit different. That the word itself is a symbol. It is a sort of a placeholder for a deeper understanding. It is not the thing in itself. Now, if I wanted to create a higher resolution understanding of feather and create alignment amongst this group, I could either share more detail in terms of how I was describing it, or I could show you an image. And then within that, we have sort of an alignment within this call of when I say feather, this is what I mean. We've effectively created a meme that we can kind of share and say anybody outside of this call doesn't understand, but internally we are aligned that we know when we say feather, this is what we're talking about more specifically. And there is sort of a greater meta awareness that can be obtained when we start to look at things like language, like our relationship with sort of the other, what are referred to as psychotechnologies that we use. By creating sort of a meta awareness, we gain a heightened ability to gain control and use these tools with a greater level of precision, use them with wisdom. I've worked with many professionals who, say, is in a leadership position, who have sold themselves short or are struggling with the obstacle of being able to create alignment in their teams because they say, oh, I've said it 100 times, but they misunderstand the fact, or they're not necessarily truly appreciating the fact that the language is only a tool. And if we want to be able to effectively communicate, we need to understand the artistry of, say, strategic storytelling, of being able to use images, being able to use dynamic resources to be able to truly transfer as much data over from here and here, from your heart and your mind, over to your audience as possible. And I bring up the term meta here because I use language here as sort of a metaphor for a deeper understanding and a deeper awareness that the modern professional can have. And the term meta is I think, really significant for us here because we are living in what is called the meta-modern era. We're no longer in postmodern, we're in meta-modern. This is significant even insofar as looking at, say, Facebook. They've changed their company name to Meta. And it's something that many of us maybe understand, but I think it's worth kind of getting a higher resolution understanding for our purposes here today, what we mean when we say the word meta. And it sort of means something that is self-referential, something that sees itself and understands itself within a particular category. And so say, for instance, the study of psychology. The study of psychology is actually very meta in that it is the human being studying the human being through the scientific method. And so it is the human being studying itself. And that is, as the kids would say, very meta. And so what I'm introducing here is something that is referred to as a meta-awareness, that for the modern business that is looking to empower itself as a, say, for instance, business owner, or empower its team, or empower its organization more broadly, understanding that there is a higher order meta-awareness that can be obtained as a capacity, that can be cultivated as an actual ability, is something that I think is going to be useful for us as we navigate the increasingly complex world and are starting to integrate AI in the workplace in a more substantive way. Now, this is, I think, a good place to start with what's called metacognition. Metacognition is the ability to watch oneself experience things. So, for instance, there are things that come out in cognitive behavioral therapy that use these tools. There are practices that help enhance the capacity of metacognition through what's called insight dialogue, which is dialogical practices, dialoguing with other people within a particular set of rules that help to hold mirrors up to ourselves and see maybe the role of emotion. How is it that, what is the role of fear or reputation management? And how is that impacting the way that I'm showing up here? Am I coming across as authentic? How am I being able to communicate myself clearly? And what is the sort of truth that maybe is not accessible to me immediately? And you know this for anybody who's done any mindfulness practice, so mindfulness meditation or other mindfulness practices more generally. The practice of mindfulness is to pop out and to observe the self going through the motions. Now, there's a lot I could share here, but I think just for the introduction, I'm just going to introduce this as a concept, because as we go into a world where we are living within sort of, as a business, say, an ecosystem that uses AI in many different ways, we are now offloading a lot of the more mechanical, kind of systematized, bureaucratic type routine processes to the systems, to the machines themselves, which then potentially either is disruptive and leaves us in a place of dysregulation, or could potentially be a huge opportunity for us to lean and enhance in things that are truly make us human, things that we are very, very kind of evolutionary attuned to do, that are not something that can be codified and turned into an AI system. So in a way, this could be a co-amplification. And by increasing our operating system, so to speak, by enhancing the culture or updating our software, by really developing our soft skills through updating our metacognition and other things that are correlated with that, we can then become better custodians, not only of the business, but actually of the team, creating more meaningful and enriched experience for employees. And as a leader, to be able to facilitate a space where this happens, I think is going to be a fundamental and extremely necessary capacity for any leader or business owner moving forward. So to kind of wrap this up, I'm speaking more to this idea of the cultivation. Up until this point, we've been using data. We've had a lot of knowledge. We have more knowledge and data than we know what to do with. But understanding the difference between knowledge and wisdom, I think, is something that's worth spending some time in considering, and where we can actually really kind of develop ourselves in terms of our ability to be potentially more wise, will help cultivate a sensitivity that will help us navigate and empower ourselves in the future. I think I'll leave it at that and see if we can explore it from there later.
Thank you, Sam. That was super interesting. And I have actually some, we'll ask them after Craig's presentation, some follow-up questions in regards to that.
Sure.
Craig, you're with us from South Africa.
I am indeed. Thank you very much, Jens and Tobias and Sam, and great to join so many startup grind hubs around the world. I'm really pleased to be sharing some thoughts with you today around AI. I mean, it's such a critically important subject, as Sam alluded to, but let me just also give a very short introduction and then jump straight into it, because this is really about understanding what AI can't do as much as it is about saying what AI can do. And I think there's a crucial piece around that. So my name is Dr. Craig Wing. I'm coming from Johannesburg in South Africa, as Jens mentioned. I've worked in tech for 20 odd years. In fact, my first company wasn't technology itself, where I used some computer programming, which formed at that stage, at least, the basis of an AI company where I was doing things around image recognition, edge detection, and speech to text. So it's been a number of years. And I've watched with interest how this has evolved over time. But more specifically today, I really want to chat about, what some of the things are that AI can't do. And for that, I turn to this very provocative image of the Ouroboros. You may recognize it, or you might know the story of the infinite snake eating its own tail that's told in either Egyptian or even Greek mythology. And the reason why I show this in the context of AI is this is exactly where we're going with AI right now. So you might have heard of something called the dead internet theory, where it's estimated that by 2030, 60, if not 65 or 75% of the internet is going to be already generated by AI. So it's going to be all Gen AI type stuff. And the result of which, when we have AI machines and LLMs in general scraping the internet, trying to obtain more information, it becomes akin to the snake eating its own tail, right? And that becomes a huge problem, because what we see now is we're seeing what's called model collapse. So some of you may have heard about this before, some of you have not. What essentially is when you have a recursive iterative process of where an AI gets taught from its outputs as its inputs, it starts to regress and it starts to get worse and worse over time. This is a real problem, and which leads to many tech companies saying, well, this is the reason why we need to keep on scraping more internet data. There's a paper that demonstrates this fact over here. For those of you who are maybe academically inclined, you can go find this over here. And they called it MAD. It's model autophagy disorder. And again, essentially what that is your output gets fed back as the input. And because you're essentially scraping and you're trying to normalize, and I'll show you what this means shortly, trying to normalize and get a statistical relevant number, AI starts to get worse over time. So what is that makes it so bad? Why is that the reason? Well, if you were to take, for argument's sake, a Gaussian distribution or a bell curve that you see over here. Now, this is by direction, it's not absolute, right? It's by direction, not absolute. If you were to say to an LLM that's driven by, machine learning or some of those very fancy techniques to say, how do we define what is an output? A GPT, like in ChatGPT, GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. And as a result of which, essentially, it's a prediction machine based on statistics. So it's a statistical machine that says, let's understand what you're trying to search for, what is your question, and how do we try to give you a statistical answer that measures that, i.e., how do we give you the most likely answer, not the actual answer itself? So let me demonstrate that. If you were to come to Google and you're going to search, you type in entrepreneurs are, you'll see something like this. Now, what this is showing you right now is this is Google search that's powered by essentially an LLM that says, based off your demographics, so maybe whoever you are, based off the cookies on your computer, your location, your cal, all those kinds of your search history, these are the most likely search questions you're asking as opposed to the absolute search question, i.e., it gives you the most likely search, not the absolute search. That's the same thing over here. So what LLMs do today is they give you the most likely truth, not the actual truth. It gives you the normative within, let's call it, one standard deviation of the mean to what your question may be. And what does it mean? Consequently, it means the outliers. It means all the stuff on the outliers over here beyond one standard deviation starts to essentially get wiped out. And as a result of which, you start getting this recursive data in the center, which then leads to model collapse. So what does this mean for us practically, and how do I tie some of this into what Sam said? Well, first of all, to the point that you made before, Sam, is, when you go up, essentially we become mirrors of ourselves. Questions become mirrors of ourselves. And I love that, because that's what AI is on the one hand. If we have a look at this curve over here, and we look at how AI is driven today, AI is a mirror of our society and how we see ourselves today. And the more we try to normalize it, the more defined we have around the general opinions. And therefore we scrub and we lose our data on the fringes over here. So the first key point is, if you want to succeed in a world driven by AI, how do you empower your startup? It's really about saying, how do I operate on the fringes? Because we know that AI will be able to do more of this mainstream center of the curve within one standard deviation thing. And that's how entrepreneurs operate. They operate around saying, how do I find opportunities in the gaps that are not known to all? So that's the first thing I'd say around empowering AI. The second thing is around the question of data. And as I'll show to you later, the tool that I've created that was born out of my PhD is about saying, how do we create unique data sets? And I think this is really important for entrepreneurs, in the startup growing community as we go, both in terms of using data, how do we ensure that we augment those data sets with our own proprietary? But if you're a creator of data, make sure that you're creating data and not just regurgitating, or else you actually add to this whole model collapse thing. What does this mean? Totality. It means the long and short of it is this. It means that the long and short of it is today, as Mikhail Kalku says, AI today is a glorified tape recorder, right? And so if we want to create businesses and we want to empower our organizations, it really is a function of saying, how do we operate over here on the fringes, not about becoming a tape recorder that gives us the same solution, the same product, the same service that might be skinned differently, that's based off the normative curve. So I thought it was a great place to start, as opposed to going around general AI stuff, which you can find plentifully all around, rather say, what can AI not do for us versus what AI can do for us to empower us to think differently. So again, operate on the fringes, mirror to society, and as I'll talk about shortly, around the tool that, in conjunction with Startup Grind, I bring to you, it's about creating unique data sets. So that's it from my side. Let me hand back over to you, Jens, for the rest of the program.
Thank you, Craig. That was super interesting. Looping back to you, Sam, in your presentation, you talked about the manager who says to the employees, I've told them 100 times, but it doesn't come across. Maybe, what do you think about using AI to basically have somebody give their message to the AI and say, hey, am I coming across clearly? Am I easy to understand? Because maybe we get a bit muddled up.
I think that, I think that example is something that can be done with an AI. I think it's something that can be done with peers as well. But I think absolutely. I mean, I think the point often with something like this is, do we actually know what we're trying to say? It's an opportunity to sort of even do a thought experiment to say, hey, if I was trying to explain this to a 7-year-old, or somebody who's born 100 years ago, would I be able to do this? And then you get rid of a lot of the noise and you distill and crystallize the essence of your point. And so what often happens is actually, and you could do this certainly with an AI, is put something forward and it goes, is this what you mean? And you go, yes, that, I'm looking to communicate that. It can help you get to a point where you clarify sort of the essence of what you're trying to say. But that would be an iterative process. And you could do that in a number of ways. But certainly, you could do that with AI.
Yeah, and when your AI gives you the feedback, it's just you and AI look each other. So, the feedback, you don't have to talk to the rest of the group.
Right.
Craig, yeah, and Craig, so in your presentation, I think, as you showed, startups, of course, wants to find those new or unique pain points where they can solve something for companies and, of course, make a business out of it. At the same time, you still need to do the accounting and all that kind of quote unquote mundane stuff in the middle. So I can see that you can have both the benefit of being in the outlier, but still using AI for things that any company needs to do to operate.
Absolutely, Jens. And I think the key piece over there is, first of all, I mean, it's like all these things. It's not an or approach; it's an and. So how do you go and say, in totality, let me look at the business in totality, right? How do I focus upon those things that I need as an entrepreneur, which is about solving a problem? That's actually fundamentally what it is. It's about saying, what's the real problem I'm solving? And all those other back office, shall we say, things, how do I automate and find ways to do that, right? We can see it already. We have a look at things like accounting. Most entrepreneurs, dare I say, are not very good at financial measures, right? But how do I offset that? Today, even without AI, you've got Xero, for argument's sake. You've got online tax advisory, right? Which, while it may not be AI per se, it's rules-driven, which actually means it is AI. So you can say, well, how do I identify what makes me an entrepreneur solving a problem, and listen to customers and being human and listen to their real problems, and then saying, what is all the other stuff that I can then automate? So can I automate my financial back office? Can I automate a version of marketing and some kind of research reports, right? Can I use it to scrub data and look at research analyst report if you're in the academic sector? How do I upload some information onto your LLMs like Notebook LLM from Google to get it to analyze? How do I get it to write the first pass of proposals? So yes, without a doubt, you can use AI to a lot of the back-end stuff to allow you and free you up to do the stuff that you're really good at and the things you should be doing as an entrepreneur, which is solving a problem.
Yeah. And even if today's event is called Empower Your Startup with AI, because we are here at Startup Grind, it's applicable to any and all companies. So, if you can really help your companies. Sam, I saw that you recently wrote a LinkedIn post, and I'm paraphrasing now, but you said, understand where you are and helping teams navigate towards business where the business wants to be. So, Craig, what should a leader do to get that helicopter perspective of where they are today as a company and where they need to go? And how can that navigation perhaps be helped with AI?
Yeah, unfortunately, I never read, I'm sure, it was a brilliant piece by Sam. I'll make it on my homework to go back and read what he says over there, right? But from a helicopter point of view, my view is, in many respects, this isn't even about AI. This is about saying, let's take a step back. Let's remember here that AI is a tool. It's a tool that allows you to accelerate to say, well, what can we do, right? So what I'd say is from a helicopter perspective, of terms of where the business is to go, would be to say, well, where do I envisage this company, this product, the solution being in 5 years' time? So how do I identify the end point as opposed to where I am? What is that last point? And then how do I work backwards from that point? In the world of academia, that happens to be called backcasting. So as opposed to forecasting, taking data and extrapolating, which tends to confine our views and biases into a certain realm. What is that end product, that end design? And most entrepreneurs do this naturally. We say, what is a world yet unseen? What is a product or solution yet unthought? How do I understand that? And then how do I realize it today? So anchor in the future, not in the past, and then work backwards from there. And I guess to use a terrible analogy of a helicopter, we'll be saying again, what's the destination? How do I end there? And then work backwards to where I am today.
No, that's a really good point. Yeah, forecasting and backcasting. Now, Sam, when you do look at this information, how do you get enough detail, enough resolution to sort of make these decisions? And how do you get to that point so that you can feel, hey, I'm going to take this direction, not that direction? And how could AI potentially help?
I would say that, I mean, the first thought that comes to mind for me around at least the first part of your question, which is how do you get enough information? I think part of running any business is going to be around your relationship with risk. I think that understanding where your own biases lie and where those could be potential derailers is important. Going back to what you were saying before, like, using an AI as a mirror in a way to be able to kind of ask it questions about things. One of the issues I do note is sometimes if you're using LLMs, they can kind of give you unconditional positive regard. And so you have to be specific and say, no, don't tell me what I want to hear. But I would say even just as a leader within a team, being able to kind of use the LLM, for instance, or generative AI to create particularly thought-provoking questions, and then to engage in a dialogue around things that we may not be considering. Sometimes a prompt is useful is to say, what are some non-obvious things? Lay out the parameters of what we know now. What are some non-obvious things that we may not be considering? It can generate those questions, and that can be something where, with humility, you as a team, you as a leader with your team, can begin to navigate and be used as a way to be able to do things that are outside your own ecosystem, outside your own feedback loop. And so it can be an opportunity to prime more creative and innovative ways of thinking. And so I would say just that blind spot and the humility to recognize we do have blind spots is usually a good place to start.
Yeah, blind spots. And I like the one about risk, because maybe people say, well, if I don't move, I won't create a new risk. But then, something passes you and then, oops, now we're behind. So a lot of this comes down to making your organization. I mean, we're going to talk later about individual and AI and organizations, but how do you make an organization change and to adopt this new tool that, like, 2.5 years ago, we kind of didn't know about it. So Craig, what's your perspective in regards to change management or manage to change within a company?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I mean, it really comes down to being able to measure certain things, right? What is the thing that you actually measure? And when I say measure, it's not the vanity metrics. We hear about this all the time, right? So it's not about the change around saying, how many incremental changes have we made? How many sales calls have we made? It's the end. What is the real metric that we have to make the change? So have we reduced the call time to X, right? Have we increased profitability by Y? What are the real metrics we have to have? So I think that's the first piece. The second thing then goes, and it's been like this for the last 10, maybe 15, maybe even 20 years, is away from the how towards the what. I think the last 2 years, driven by AI, the how is now being changed very quickly. So in the past, you have to go through a process, maybe iterated, maybe team members. And while I'm not discounting it, I'm saying let's augment it with AI right now. So it's about saying to your team, okay, fine, what are the things that we need to do at the end of the day? How do we set those goals? Now, I leave it to you to determine how to do that. Here's the deadline. This is what needs to be done, right? So I'm very much a proponent of saying, how do we get the right people in? Giving them ownership, holding them very accountable to very strict and measurable deadlines. But how they do that is different. After that process, I would then go back and say, how do I now understand how you did it, to then find best practices to then decentralize it across the org.
Sam, what are your thoughts in regards to change management?
Just to build off of some of what Craig was saying there, and I believe this is sort of in line with what he's outlined here, is this sense of kind of giving people an opportunity to kind of visualize a new way of doing things as well. In fact, there's I can even share something. It wasn't necessarily part of this slide here, but I think it's useful to kind of envision potentially just a new, even just as a thought experiment, a new way of understanding how a business might organize themselves. Now, this was something around strategic agility, but you can see here it was developed by Hancock et al., where they're talking about how sort of ever since the Industrial Revolution, we've kind of had this more mechanized hierarchical way of doing things, and now moving towards something that's more organic, and actually being able to see how by offloading some of the bureaucratic cognitive processing energy that goes into all the stuff, offloading that to AI systems gives us the ability to actually be more agile and adaptive. And so when it comes to change management, I think oftentimes it's what do people need to feel how can they see themselves in the solution? And I think being able to frame things in a way where they actually see it as making their lives easier, more meaningful, richer, more playful. I think that's where you can start to get people to buy in, where you can go against some of the initial natural resistance to change that can sometimes happen. But honest conversations and transparency, not pretending that these things aren't necessarily going to be difficult, I think is always the first step.
Yeah, and I mean, I spend quite some time on YouTube and so on. I follow a lot of different people learning about AI, but I know people are also very busy. So like work is work, and your time outside work now. And as an individual, I can feel, hey, I can do things much faster. So, but I really like that graph, Sam, about sort of empowering not only the individuals but also the organization. But also, how would you suggest that you create a sort of a knowledge bank or internal knowledge sharing, where you feel that what you are looking at is stuff that also the manager or the organization has not only approved but knows it's in the right direction of the company? Because if what I watch on YouTube is what I feel is most interesting, but it might not be 100% what is the best for the company. So what are your thoughts about that? How to get from an empowered individual to an empowered organization, Craig?
Yeah, Jens. I mean, I think so. The first question I'd have is to say, one of the challenges we always have is to try to default to technology. We try to say, well, how's tech? How do we solve this thing, right? And again, I'm going to say, what you're saying to me right now is, if the individual pockets and the individuals have got the knowledge, how do we capture that? So how do we move from a tacit knowledge base towards a systemized methodology is one way, right? So the first thing I think to say is to say, well, how do we understand that we actually are learning things? Because there's an implicit question over here. That's the assumption that the members of my team, albeit 2 or 20 or 200, we've got individual learning. So let's understand, have we got that? How do you know you've got that? Well, first of all, it's by having these conversations. It's by saying, well, how do we have a town hall? How do I have a feedback session? How to understand those? I think that's challenge number one, right? Challenge number two then is to say, well, or rather, process, I say that would be step number one. Step number two ties it to Sam's point, and I like that decentralized organization by Hancock. Hopefully it's not Graham Hancock. That would be a different story altogether. But I like that a lot, because it pretty much shows us that when you consider AI as another assistant or another intern that can do the grunt work, right? So plain and simple, have people around the table talk about this, record those lessons, automate it, transcribe it, pull the key lessons across, share that stuff. That now becomes a data pool, a data lake, if you will, around saying, how do we create a repository of information? You can then today already use open source code and LLMs to say, well, here's a problem. Have any of the previous 10, 20, 500 conversations led to this point where I can find a solution with previous stuff? So again, I think it starts with the human. It starts with understanding the human in terms of who we are. And then you can empower the organization by then codifying that process. But it is based, again, if I said before, that actual prime data that you create, because it's context of your organization.
And Sam, I like the picture of the feather that you showed in the beginning, saying like if we describe it with words, we probably have different versions of the feather. This interview is also going on YouTube, so it will have a global audience. Now, what are your thoughts in regards to, do we need to have more lunch and learns at the company now within the era of AI than we needed maybe 5 years ago, to exchange ideas and learn quicker? How can we make it best for the whole team so that everybody can participate?
Thinking about what you've shared there, this idea of lunch and learns, I think there's something that comes up for me that looks at that and senses this opportunity to kind of take things like that I think are directionally in the right, kind of going in the right direction. They feel like they're sort of positive and they're constructive in that way. How effective they are, maybe historically, is something that I would potentially question. I think maybe in some instances they are. You also don't want it to be something that feels like a burden, which goes back to what I was saying before, like the modern leader learning to facilitate in ways. I think you could take a lunch and learn and enhance that by 10x just by some really well thought out facilitation techniques that could take less time. You could use AI as a way of capturing essence of what's being, shared, and kind of take things and transform the culture by creating sort of customs, sort of rituals within the organization as part of the bedrock of the culture itself. And that sort of, by having these customs in place, these are just the ways that we do things here, is that, as a leader, I have a once a month, I do this type of exercise with the group. It creates this sort of generative dialogue. And then what we do is we capture that, and that's then distributed to the rest of the organization. And then what we do is we follow that up with little notes that take a couple minutes independently for people to feed back, and we use that as a way to kind of converge on final solutions and so on. I guess my point here really being is that I think we shouldn't be married to the way that we did things before, and allow these things to be more organic, and to use practices that are outside of business in some cases, like sort of cutting edge facilitation techniques, and teach our leaders how to do them, so that they can turn these into the very way in which they lead, and let that spark and emerge their own processes and systems. Let it be something that's not transplanted, but grown rather.
No, that's a very good point. Now, also, because I know we at StartupGrind, we try to stay within the 1 hour and a little bit mindful of time, and we can move some of the questions also to Q&A. Now, how do you stay, you yourself, Sam and Craig, how do you keep updated on AI? Who do you watch, and how do you consume information about AI to stay on top of things? Craig.
Yeah, it's such a fast moving area, Jens. I get asked this kind of question a lot, whether it's AI or the future, or Bitcoin was the big thing, or AR, right? I mean, I'd be remiss to say, have a look at this thing. Specifically around AI, I actually want to understand what is the common consciousness. I want to understand what is the common baseline. So as opposed to saying, what's almost like saying, as opposed to saying, well, who's the forefront leader, what's the lowest common denominator? And I'll tell you why that's the case, right? As soon as something becomes common or just there and thereabouts, it starts breaking the consciousness. How do you find a way to massage a message that fits that audience? So for me, I wish I could give you a more articulated answer. I turn to X or Twitter as it used to be, right? And try to understand what is the baseline. So what's the baseline around what's going on in AI? And then try to elevate yourself 1, 2, 3 steps just above that. Not so far, because you can be so far ahead where it makes zero sense to you whatsoever, right? I'd like to understand the baseline, how to articulate that, and then come back and say, how do I translate that in some kind of actionable step, whether that's for my own team, whether it's about a product fit, whether it's about empowering my organization. What's the baseline? How do I go from there?
Sam?
Yeah, I think I echo Craig's point there about being remiss about just listing out, say, podcasts that I listen to. Maybe it's something that was a follow-up to this. I can send a list of some things that I do listen to. Something that's been useful for me in this is understanding the difference between AI. The way that this was broken down in a podcast I was listening to is AI as an agent and AI as a environment. You think about AI in terms of as an environment, that's sort of the way it works in our algorithms. It's things that we're not necessarily attending to that are kind of everywhere all the time and do influence the way that we consume media, influence things that we do. And so there's sort of the environment as a category, and then there's the agent, which is sort of the more popular ones where we think about ChatGPT. But AI is obviously a broad topic that has a lot of subcategories, and I think that's going to continue to get subdivided. Just from a personal note, I'm very interested in sort of the psychology side of things. So there are psychologists that I follow who are working alongside tech companies who really do, and this goes back to what Craig is saying, is help us understand what are these systems doing and what can't they do. And it helps us kind of, again, see what our humanity is, and where we are seeing things that are like, oh, it's human-like. We also recognize things that it struggles with that a 5-year-old can do with very little energy. And these things are taking a lot of energy to do. So there are just some fundamental differences that I'm curious about that I think are important. And so I tend to look into the domain of like cognitive psychology and how that's kind of happening. I'm happy to share more, maybe as an afterthought.
Yeah, and it's going to be very interesting coming years. As you said, 5-year-old, when AI is, was it 2.5? Well, machine learning has been around for a long time, but generative AI not so long. So as it grows up, it's going to become more and more of a person that we can have a discussion with. Now, Sam and Craig, we're not going to end the event right now. I'm going to actually hand over to Tobias, who is going to have the Q&A, and then Craig, we're also going to come back to you in regards to what the Foresight survey. So Tobias.
Hello, yes, thank you. So if anyone has some questions, and perhaps there are many, then either raise your hand or put it in the chat, most easy one. We have already a question in the chat, but before we come to that, I just want to let you know that the poll is still open. So if you want to participate now, or if you want to change your opinion, you have still the opportunity to do so. But back to the question. Hello, everyone. Thanks for hosting the session. As an engineer, I'm familiar with standard deviation, as well as the idea of finding niche problem and solving it. Would you mind giving more tips on the 0 to 1 steps when you have a solution and how to share your solution to a target audience? do we best communicate our solution to our target audience? Thanks.
Sure, I can give it a bash, seeing that we started around that standard deviation thing, and also being an engineer myself, and I think there's pros and cons, right? So, and I'm in the chat window over here. I think it's Kayla, either Kayla or Kyla. Thanks for the question. The first thing I'd say is to say, are you solving a real problem, right? And this could become an issue for an engineer because, again, I'm stereotyping hugely over here. Engineers are prone to fall into paralysis analysis. So how do I understand this? How do I do the research? How do I get the databases? How do I do all the data quant stuff? Whereas what we should be doing is should be going speaking to people and saying, is this a real problem and how do we understand it? So I think that straight off the bat, the first thing I'd be saying is this a real problem that we're solving, right? And then secondly, then to say, how big is this problem? I work with entrepreneurs. I've worked with thousands over my lifetime. They are solving a real problem. It is absolutely true. But the problem set is so small that it only solves a real burning problem for 10, 20, maybe 100 people. That's incredibly difficult to solve a problem for, right? So how to identify something that's scale, something that's really, really big. Then to actually implement, and your question specifically is around saying, well, how do I share a solution with the audience? The first thing I'd say is, again, kind of like that problem, what's the value you create? Now, how do you test that hypothesis? How do you test the value creation with people that are having this problem? And how do you then iterate around that? So I would say it's not about saying, launch necessarily and have a commercial model around that. How do I generate some kind of traction, some kind of demonstrable results that then leads to maybe a testimonial or some kind of runway and use that as your test bed? Once you have that, then I'd say, well, how do we bulk up a value addition on top of that? So again, let's use some engineering talk over here. Let's go back to first principles. Are we sorting a real problem? Once I have that, what's the system process around that? How do I understand the system? And then let's prototype or MVP and using a design process, understand what's the real problem. How do we iterate that? How do we get some kind of feedback and then only then find a way to monetize based off the assumption that we have got some real value across that.
Okay, thanks for that. I hope that gives some insight to the question. Jens, I think you also mentioned during the interview that you have a question for the Q&A.
Yes, I mean, I have a lot of questions because it's not having the opportunity to talk to Sam and Craig. Now, when you set, okay, easy one. How do you celebrate success when it comes to AI? How do you we talked about measurement before, and we don't want to become bureaucratic, so we don't want to implement a time reporting system to keep track of how much AI but how do you celebrate the successes with AI, and how do you find them?
That's going to have to be a Sam. That's a Sam question. That's definitely not a Craig question. I can tell you that.
I guess, can I clarify the question just to see if I'm understanding it? It's how do we celebrate the successes that we've achieved in terms of landmarks of adopting and integrating AI into the way that we work, or successes that we've achieved using AI as a tool externally outward in our business?
Well, so when I went to an AWS event last week, and they spoke about how much time you could save and on using AI. And of course, it was a report from McKinsey. Now, a lot of people say, like, hey, those targets are not reasonable, but they might be reasonable because they come of some research, and McKinsey probably has very good researchers. But when you get to that, when you start at zero and you want to get those gradual gains, like how do you capture that you're saving time without creating a time reporting, a bureaucracy of reporting that you're saving time on AI? So that's kind of what I'm looking for.
Right.
Could be internal, could be external.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, thank you for clarifying that. That definitely makes things clear for me. And so what comes up for me in this is, it's kind of looking at proxies, like what are you measuring? And I think one of the issues for a lot of knowledge work is that we've kind of adopted the Industrial Revolution sense of, how many widgets per minute. And we've kind of brought that into the office space. And so we stay very busy. And we can sometimes mistake being busy for being productive, quantity for quality. And when it comes to knowledge work, I think having a conversation about, well, how do we measure productivity, which is sort of what your question is. And I guess what would be useful in this is, what are we looking for and how do we understand what quality is? Start with what we want in terms of quality, and how do we want our teams to be spending their time. Like, I think one of the biggest issues, and this kind of speaks to the celebration piece here, one of the biggest issues is that you can find in offices where the sense of being busy, it can feel competitive because that's the only way I can demonstrate that I'm doing good work. But if there is a common subsumed understanding within the culture that actually productivity gains are not just about being busy, that actually you are expected to sit and problem solve and think about things. You see this at universities where professors will sit in canteens doing what would seem to be, like, for some people, very lazy work, but they're actually having really generative exchanges with one another. If we could then reorganize and re-standardize how we're measuring progress within knowledge work specifically, that may answer the question a little bit more. Now, how we celebrate that may be different for different companies, but I think that when we need to celebrate, we'll just feel like it makes sense. It'll be intuitive once we've clarified and got a better understanding of what quality is and understood how we should be spending our time.
No, I really like that.
Thank you for that. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but having the time in mind, maybe just one last question in this context. I'm not sure who wants to jump in. Maybe you both, but with a brief answer. I quite liked your analogy with the snake, a snake eating their own tail, and I think that's really an issue. If we think about the internet, we probably cannot do so much as a single player in the game, in our startup, in our company. We can do something. Do you have some idea how to manage internal data with AI? And is there the same pattern, or is there something we can actually manage or control?
Yeah, so from my side, I mean, I think the first thing is just to understand the various stages of data and how do we go from data first to information to knowledge to insights to wisdom, right? So I think there's a path around that. The data itself, a lot of organizations got so much data, Tobias, so they don't even know what to do with it, right? So the first thing is how do we again almost like craft a use case? So how do we understand almost the progression, the evolution of this data thing to the end piece would be insights, but above that, and Sam touched on this also, the wisdom piece. So my first thing would be say, what's useful, what's not, right? Because also we got to find out, almost like in the engineering term, what's the SNR, the signal to noise ratio? So the first thing I'd say is it useful, is it not? How do I craft the case? How do I test it? And then also, once you have that, how do I then validate it? And that's the piece of the snake piece, right? Because without the validation, we just kind of converge. So how do I validate it internally? Because the question was internal data around both the producers and consumer of that data, of the data to wisdom, process, extrapolation, flow.
Okay. Did you want to add something in this context? Do you have some actionable advice, Sam?
I mean, I think it goes back to my initial point. I mean, that sensibility, this is something that we're really very highly attuned to do, is by cultivating a greater awareness of ourselves, we are able to see certain patterns in the world around us. You know, if I say to you, you know, look around you for things that are made of plastic, all of a sudden I look at this, that's made of plastic, that's made of plastic. It pops out in my reality. I'm not looking at it unless I'm actually looking for it. And so similar to if you have a baby, things that are relevant to babies become more apparent to you in the world. And so what is relevant to you, what you care about, impacts what you view. And what you view will then in turn impact what actions you can take. So that's more of a high level understanding, but that harmonizing those things speaks to the wisdom that can help you orientate and calibrate what you're seeing and help you see opportunities in your horizon and maybe what you should and should not be looking at in terms of signal and noise.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So I'm closing this with a quick look at the results from our poll. How do you feel about the growing role of generative AI? And as we can see here, probably given to the audience, most people here are very excited about the potential and believe that it will greatly enhance innovation, but even more are cautiously optimistic, but ethical issues remain. There's no one believing that we are doomed. I hope that didn't change during the session, and we will stay optimistic in this context. Even so, I kind of agree. As with any new technology, we still have to figure out some of the edges and how to deal with it.
And maybe also there when it comes into how do we make this visible. So Greg, you're going to show us about the WhatTheForesight tool that we can use to ask ourselves questions as organizations and so on, and sort of get a map. Would you like to share your screen? So anyone who's part of this call is going to be able to use that tool as well. Test it.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely right. So I've partnered with Startup Grind, and really the commitment there with Startup Grind, but even beyond that, is that once I show you what it is, but essentially for any company less than 10, which is usually and almost exclusively for startups, you can use this tool for free. So WhatTheForesight is a tool that I created that was based off my PhD, and essentially it's a Myers-Briggs for organizations, right? using sentiment analysis, etc. But it's really about saying, how do you profile organizations and how do I start to understand what are the real issues that are burning within my organization? Now, even though I use the term organization, I don't mean gigantic companies. It can be as small as two co-founders trying to understand, are we on the same page around our future? But even a company of 3, 4, 5 up to 10, they can start to use this, right? So what is it fundamentally? Well, there's 25 questions that come through, and these 25 questions are based off the research that I had following this backcasting approach that I spoke about before, and you answer 25 questions twice, which is really today and tomorrow. So for argument's sake over here, is your company able to operationalize and implement adequately to meet your strategic plans? You could then watch a little video if you didn't know what that meant, right? And then you'd simply drag a slider. You answer that question in terms of how do you think you'll be able to operationalize both today and in the future. And the future is where I think I'm going to be, not where I want to be. So it's very simple, 25 questions asked twice, some demographic data. And what it comes down to is this thing over here. And there's 25 attributes. And I'm going to walk you through this very quickly, that by answering this, either with your team or through your team or in conjunction with, we can amalgamate all these different answers. So a company of, let's say, 7 people, small startup of 7 people, you'll have an aggregate view of all 7, right? And what you see is you start seeing curves that look like this. So these are 2 different companies. But what you're seeing is you're seeing the 25 attributes mapped out. And you're seeing that from 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock, that's leadership, which is the first important core component. From 2 o'clock till about 8 o'clock, it's organization. And then from 8 o'clock back to 12 o'clock, it's landscape. And what you can see very quickly is you can see 2 things. You can see the orange, which is the future, where I'm going to be, and the blue of where I am today. Based off these curves, you can see, are we going in the right direction based off the perception of the respondees? So whether that might be the executives, maybe it's the founders, maybe it's marketing, wherever it might be, are we going in the right direction? Orange close to the circumference in the blue. Next thing we can see is where the dips that say we need to focus on these areas, because these are areas of concern today and maybe in the future as well. And then finally, what are the deltas and the gaps to say, how do we understand that these are the places of hard conversations to have? But for example, on the right-hand side, what you might see, like over here at 2 o'clock, you might see an outlier. And this is very bad for this organization. These are real companies where essentially what we're seeing is the belief is that this company is not going to be better with leadership over time. They're actually going to regress. So what this means for a founder and what it means for startup ground entrepreneurs is, one, it allows us to have very hard conversations by surfacing the key issues around our organization and saying, where are the issues to have? So where the issues we might have, and then how do we address them? So this doesn't tell you exactly how to fix them. It just says there's an issue over here, there's maybe an issue over here, or there's an issue over here. Now let's go have those conversations. But because we've got the demographic data, we can even go a step further and we can say, how do you look at demographics? Demographics here could be sex, could be age, could be race, or could be department, like I'm showing right now. Now, this is a big consulting company, and essentially what you're looking at is, on the left-hand side, you're looking at the rating for today, and on the right-hand side, the rating for the future. Again, leadership, organization, landscape, and there's a whole bunch of different divisions. But the most important thing that I want you to focus on is this. That last block is the average of all these responses, and what you'll see is the one next to it, the orange one, the little circle is below the gray for all instances, both today and the future, and that's the strategy team. So this is a big corporate that did this. And what we're seeing over here is we're seeing that the strategy team is not as optimistic either today or the future around this organization. Again, we can say, why is this the issue? Let's go to the strategy team and understand why. As it turns out, this corporation had just gone through a strategic review of the strategy for the strategy team, right? And that would explain to us why there's some kind of unease over here on the left-hand side today. But it doesn't explain this in the future. The only way that we can understand this, the only way we can interpret this data, is it means the strategic team that have used WhatTheForesight, the tool itself, don't believe in the new strategy in the future. So this tool is really powerful. It really gives us a lens to say, how do we think about where we are today? Where do you want to be in the future? And then finally, how do we address these things and overcome what's called founder syndrome, where we believe that we have all the answers. We know we have everything. And sometimes our team don't want to ask us and they want to push us. But this allows us to do it both anonymously and unanonymously. And again, because of Startup Grind and the relationship I have with the different hubs and you today, it's brought to you completely for free. And I'm going to ensure that as much as I can, this will be free for lifetime. So go to the website, WhatTheForesight.com. You can see more information and you can do the survey to get the analysis for yourself.
Great presentation. And Sam, thank you very much for your contribution. Now, this is also going to be a video that's put on YouTube, so you might be watching this in the future. So Sam and Craig, how do you want people to reach out to you? And LinkedIn,
Yeah.
good one.
So for myself, LinkedIn, very easy. Find me. You can find me, Craig Wing. Just don't click on the Australian rugby player. There is an Australian rugby player, by the way. So LinkedIn is the best place to find me from a business context, obviously on socials as well, but LinkedIn is the best. And again, Jens, Tobias, Sam, real pleasure working with all of you.
Thank you. And Sam, also LinkedIn.
Also LinkedIn, Sam Bobertz, and company is StarMaker. Again, just to echo what Craig said, thank you, Tobias and Jen. This is a lot of fun. And Craig, always a pleasure.
Thank you all, everybody who was here today. And if you watch this on YouTube, thank you for watching. And then you can click the more and you can find the links to the different people. So big thank you, Sam and Craig, for a very, very interesting presentation. And yeah, we're looking forward to see where AI can take us and how it can empower us in the future. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.